This is the story of Chuck Norris, the man the internet turned into an indestructible joke, and the string of real losses that shaped him long before anyone found that funny. He died on March 19, 2026, at the age of 86, and underneath the legend was a life that started in fear, ran through grief, and never really escaped either one. Carlos Ray Norris was born on March 10, 1940, in the small town of Ryan, Oklahoma, to a mother named Wilma and a father named Ray. Wilma carried Irish roots, and Ray brought German, British, and Cherokee heritage into the family, but heritage wasn't the thing that defined the household. Ray's drinking was. He worked on and off as a mechanic, a bus driver, and a truck driver, disappearing into binges that stretched on for months at a time, and the man who came home during those stretches was not someone his sons wanted to be around. Chuck was the oldest of three boys. Whelan came next, then Aaron, and the three of them grew up bracing for their father's moods the way other kids braced for weather. Norris later wrote about the sound of running water setting his father off if he had a hangover, about the shouting and the threats that followed, about the night his father tried to force his mother to hand over $5 she had been saving for groceries. When the rage started, Chuck and Whelan didn't argue and didn't intervene. They hid in the bedroom and waited for it to end. Norris described himself, in his own words, as the shy kid who never excelled at anything in school. Not athletic, not confident, not particularly noticed by anyone. The embarrassment of his father's drinking and the family's constant money troubles pushed him further into himself, and that introversion followed him for years. His only real heroes growing up were fictional ones, cowboys on movie screens who never seemed afraid of anything, which says something about a boy who very much was. There was no single bad night that explained everything. It was the accumulation, month after month, of a father who could not be predicted, a mother trying to hold three sons together on very little money, and a house where the arrival of a car in the driveway could mean an ordinary evening or an unbearable one. Children in that kind of home learn to read footsteps and tone of voice the way other children learn to read. Norris grew up fluent in his father's moods long before he grew up fluent in anything else, and that particular skill, watching for danger before it arrived, would follow him quietly into everything he built afterward. What makes the story harder to sit with is how ordinary it must have felt from the inside. Whelan and Chuck didn't know their childhood was unusual. It was simply what a Tuesday night could turn into. The bedroom they hid in wasn't a symbol yet. It was just the safest room in the house, and the two boys who huddled there together had no way of knowing that one of them would be dead by 27 and the other would spend the rest of his life training his body so that he would never again feel as powerless as he did on those nights. When Chuck turned 16, his parents finally divorced, and Wilma packed up her three sons and left. The family moved first to Prairie Village, Kansas, and then settled in Torrance, California, chasing a version of stability none of them had ever really had. That move mattered more than it might sound like on paper. It pulled Chuck away from the house where he'd spent a childhood hiding, and it put him for the first time somewhere he could start building an identity that had nothing to do with his father. At 18, he did two things that would define the rest of his life. He married his high school sweetheart, Diane Holchek, and that same year, in 1958, he enlisted in the United States Air Force. The timing wasn't an accident. Enlisting gave him an exit, a set of rules that made sense, and a place far enough from home that his father's shadow couldn't reach him. He was stationed at Osan Air Base in South Korea, working as an air policeman, and it was there, thousands of miles from Oklahoma, that he first started training in martial arts. What he found in that training was something his childhood had never offered him, a direct line between effort and result. Practice a technique enough times, and it improved. Show up, put in the work, and something measurable changed. For a kid who grew up in a house where nothing was predictable and nothing was within his control, that discipline became the first real ground he'd ever stood on. He left the Air Force in 1962 and opened a karate studio back in California, teaching lessons to support his young family while Diane raised their sons, Mike and Eric. He wasn't chasing fame. He was chasing competence, the feeling of mastering something completely after a lifetime of feeling like he mastered nothing. And it worked. By the late 1960s, he had become one of the most dominant competitors in American karate, earning his first world middleweight championship in 1968 and defending the title 5 more times before retiring undefeated after a final win in 1974. This is usually where a success story would end its opening chapter and move on to the glory. But the tragedy running underneath Chuck Norris's life didn't pause just because he'd finally found something he was good at. Even as he became one of the toughest competitors in the country, the people closest to him kept absorbing losses that no amount of skill could prevent. It's worth sitting with that timing for a moment. A man who had spent his childhood terrified of a father he couldn't control finally builds a body and a discipline he can control completely, wins championship after championship, and proves to himself publicly that he is no longer that frightened boy. And almost immediately, the universe hands him a different kind of powerlessness, one that no black belt could touch. Karate could teach him how to defend himself. Nothing could teach him how to survive a phone call telling him his little brother was dead. At the height of the Vietnam War, both of his younger brothers enlisted in the army. Aaron was stationed in Korea, Wieland was sent into Vietnam, and before he left, he told Chuck something strange, something that felt at the time like nervous talk but turned out to be closer to a warning. He said he didn't think he'd live to see his 27th birthday. In 1970, Chuck was refereeing a karate tournament in California when an announcement interrupted the event, calling him to take an urgent phone call. That call carried the news every military family feared most. Wieland had been walking point on patrol, the most exposed position in the formation, the first man who would encounter an ambush if one was waiting. He spotted the danger, tried to warn the rest of his unit, and was shot and killed before he could get clear. Wieland Norris was 27 years old when he died. His own prediction had come true almost exactly as he'd said it would, and Chuck carried that particular detail with him for the rest of his life. 27. That's the number Wieland gave his brother as an offhand warning before shipping out, and it's the exact age he never got past, which is the kind of detail that stops feeling like coincidence and starts feeling like something a person carries in their chest for the rest of their life. He attended his brother's funeral, and years later, once he'd become a movie star, he poured that grief directly into his work. His 1984 film Missing in Action, about a former prisoner of war who returns to Vietnam to free soldiers still being held, was made as a tribute to Wieland. Moviegoers saw an action hero storming through the jungle with a rifle. What they didn't see was an older brother who had spent over a decade trying, one film at a time, to bring somebody home who was never coming back. Grief like that doesn't resolve itself just because a person becomes famous or successful or strong. It sits underneath everything, and for Norris, it seems to have surfaced again and again in the projects he chose, and in the quiet weight he carried whenever Wieland's name came up in conversation. A staring contest with the sun makes for a good internet joke. A brother who spent decades trying to rescue fictional prisoners because he couldn't save the real one does not. The losses didn't stop there. Ray Norris, the father whose drinking had defined Chuck's entire childhood, died in 1971, just 1 year after Wieland. In the span of 12 months, Chuck buried a brother who died young and violently, and a father whose own decline had shaped almost everything about how Chuck grew up. All of this happened before he'd made a single Hollywood film, before Walker, Texas Ranger, before any of the fame that would eventually define how the public saw him. The toughest chapters of his life were already behind him by the time most people started paying attention. His acting career began almost by accident. A student at his karate studio suggested he try it, and a fight scene opposite Bruce Lee introduced him to audiences well beyond the martial arts world. Through the late 1970s and into the 1980s, Norris became one of the defining action stars in American film, appearing in Good Guys Wear Black, Forced Vengeance, Lone Wolf McQuade, Code of Silence, and The Delta Force alongside Lee Marvin. And here's where the irony of his public image starts to take real shape. The characters he played were emotionally sealed off, silent, in complete control, impossible to rattle. Audiences loved that version of him so much that almost nobody thought to ask what was underneath it. They didn't know about the bedroom he used to hide in. They didn't know about the brother he'd buried at 27, or the father he'd buried a year later, or the fact that the calm, unshakable men he played on screen were, in some sense, a costume built over a kid who had spent his whole childhood afraid. His marriage to Diane, the one that started at 18 before any of the fame existed, ended in divorce in 1989 after roughly 3 decades together and 2 grown sons. 3 decades of a demanding career, constant travel, and the pressure of stardom had worn the relationship down, and it finally gave way. It's a familiar pattern in Hollywood, but for Norris it was one more relationship from his early life, one more piece of the world he'd built before the myth took over, that the myth eventually cost him. Think about what Diane represented in his story. She was there before the karate titles, before the movie posters, before anyone outside a handful of dojos knew his name. She married the shy, mediocre student who hid from his father, not the action star. By the time the marriage ended, that version of Chuck Norris barely existed in public anymore, replaced almost entirely by the stoic, unshakable figure audiences paid to watch. Whatever tenderness or vulnerability had once lived between 2 18-year-olds in Torrance had to compete, for 30 years, with a growing legend that left less and less room for either of them to simply be a young married couple. By 1989, that competition was over, and the legend had won. By the early 1990s, his box office pull had faded, and he shifted to television, playing Cordell Walker on Walker, Texas Ranger for 8 seasons. It was a hit, but a smaller stage than the one he'd occupied a decade earlier, and it looked for a while like his career was simply easing toward its natural end the way most careers do. Then something unexpected happened. In the mid-2000s, a joke format exploded across the early internet. Absurd, exaggerated claims about Chuck Norris's imagined superhuman toughness. He never dies. He can divide by 0. He once had a staring contest with the sun and won. Norris had no hand in creating any of it, yet almost overnight he became famous again, decades after his commercial peak, not for his acting or his championships, but for a cartoon version of invincibility that strangers on the internet had built around his name. It brought him book deals and advertising campaigns and a strange second act nobody could have predicted. But there's something quietly sad tucked inside that story too. A man who had spent his entire life proving, through real discipline and real sacrifice, that he was not the powerless boy who used to hide from his father, was now famous mainly for a joke that had nothing to do with any of that. The culture wasn't interested in Wieland or Ray or the divorce or the grief that had shaped him. It wanted the myth because the myth was easier to laugh at than the man. In 1998, Norris married Gina O'Kelly, and later in life, in his late 50s and 60s, he became a father again, welcoming twins Dakota and Danilee born via surrogate. From the outside, it looked like a second chapter defined by peace after so much early loss. That peace didn't last. In late 2012, Gina underwent a series of MRI scans, 3 of them within about an 8-day span, and doctors used a gadolinium-based contrast agent to sharpen the images each time. Shortly afterward, she began experiencing a pounding sensation in her chest and an intense burning that spread through her body. It didn't fade. It got worse. What followed was years of hospitalizations, cognitive problems that made it hard for her to think clearly or find words, kidney damage, muscle wasting that stripped away her strength and mobility, rib damage severe enough to make simple breathing painful. Chuck later described a moment in that hospital, watching his wife and being told, in essence, that she was dying right in front of him, with no clear explanation and no clear fix. Conventional medicine had no answer for what was happening to her, so Gina went looking outside it. She traveled as far as China, seeking treatments like chelation therapy and stem cell procedures that sat well outside mainstream care. The family spent close to $2 million over roughly 5 years trying to treat a condition most doctors weren't even trained to recognize, let alone cure. Picture what those years actually looked like day to day. A man famous for playing characters who solved every problem with a well-placed kick was instead spending his time in waiting rooms, on long flights to unfamiliar countries, signing checks for treatments nobody could guarantee would work, and watching his wife lose pieces of herself that no amount of willpower could bring back. There was no opponent to train against and no fight to win in a single scene. Just years of uncertainty, stretched out far longer than any movie would have allowed, with no script guaranteeing the ending would be a good one. In 2017, Chuck and Gina filed a lawsuit in San Francisco Superior Court against 11 medical companies, including McKesson, Bracco, and Assist Medical Systems, alleging the gadolinium contrast agent had poisoned her and seeking $10 million in damages. The case turned the Norrises into public faces of a growing safety debate around gadolinium, and it helped push regulators toward stronger warnings on a drug that had been used in hundreds of millions of scans worldwide. Years later, without any settlement, the lawsuit was quietly withdrawn. No dramatic verdict, no clean resolution, just years of a family's private suffering that had been made public and was eventually folded away. Think about what that meant for a man whose entire public identity rested on being unbreakable. The deepest crisis of his later life wasn't a fight he could win with skill or discipline. It was watching, powerless, as the person he loved most was slowly broken down by something as unglamorous as a routine hospital procedure, with no villain to confront and no fair contest to win. Toughness didn't help. Discipline didn't help. All he could do was stay next to her and spend whatever it took trying to get her back. Around this same period, according to later reporting, Norris also suffered 2 heart attacks in July of 2017, reportedly requiring a 240-mile dash by ambulance and helicopter to reach emergency care in time. Even the man built into a symbol of indestructibility was, underneath all of it, dealing with a body that was aging and failing in the ordinary ways bodies do. As he moved into his 80s, Norris pulled back from public life. He kept training. He posted the occasional video of himself sparring, always warm, always grateful, always projecting the same disciplined vitality he had built his entire identity around since that first karate class in South Korea more than 60 years earlier. His mother, Wilma, who had packed up her 3 sons decades earlier and moved them toward a better life, lived to 103 years old before passing away in 2024, giving Chuck one more milestone of loss to carry in his final years. On March 10, 2026, he turned 86. He marked it with an Instagram video of himself boxing on a beach in Kauai, joking in the caption that he didn't age, he leveled up, and thanking his fans for a lifetime of support. Nothing about that post suggested an ending. It read like an ordinary happy moment from an ordinary week. 8 days later, on March 18th, he was rushed to Wilcox Medical Center in Lihue, Kauai, following a sudden medical emergency. Friends who had spoken with him just hours earlier described him as being in good spirits, training, cracking jokes, showing no sign that anything was wrong. Whatever happened, happened fast, and it happened without warning. He died the next morning, March 19, 2026, surrounded by his family. He was 86 years old. His cause of death was not made public. His family asked in their statement for privacy while they grieved, and they described him in 2 very different ways in the same breath. To the world, they wrote, he had been a martial artist, an actor, and a symbol of strength. To them, he had simply been a husband, a father, a grandfather, and a brother, the heart of a family that had already survived so much loss long before any of the fame existed. That contrast is really the whole story. The world got the symbol, the family got the man, and the man had spent his entire life absorbing losses that the symbol was never built to show. A boy who hid from his father's rage, a brother who buried a sibling at 27 who never got the chance to see that age for himself. A husband who sat in hospital rooms for years, powerless, while his wife fought something with no clean villain and no clean ending. A performer who spent decades being celebrated for a toughness that had started out originally as a defense a frightened kid built just to get through his own house. Chuck Norris didn't need the myth to matter. The real story, the one built from an alcoholic father, a brother lost to Vietnam at exactly the age he predicted, a first marriage worn down by fame, a wife nearly destroyed by a medical procedure meant to help her, and a body that finally gave out on a quiet island in March of 2026 was always more remarkable than the joke. He was not the man who couldn't be hurt. He was the man who kept getting hurt over and over across 60 years and kept getting back up anyway. And that pattern started decades before anyone was watching, in a bedroom he shared with a brother he'd eventually bury at 27. Every version of Chuck Norris the public ever celebrated, the champion, the movie star, the meme, was built on top of that same starting point. A frightened kid who decided one karate class at a time that he would never again feel as powerless as he did hiding from his own father. That's what gets lost in every joke about him being unkillable. He was killable in the end, just as mortal as anyone else, and the losses that came before his fame, the brother, the father, the marriage, the years spent watching his wife suffer, proved that better than any punchline ever could. The toughness people loved him for was never about being incapable of pain. It was about what he did with pain he was never able to avoid. That was never a joke, and it was the truest thing about him.